The issue of death penalty is an interesting but not too controversial an issue under constitutional law in the United States in the 21st century. Now, the reason why this comes under constitutional law in the first place is because the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. However, in the age of the Founding Fathers, when the Bill of Rights was written, death penalty was considered neither cruel nor unusual. Not only was it practiced all over the colonies and then the states, but it was also very common in Europe. In fact, in England, all kinds of serious crimes were punished by death penalty. So why would we presume today that death penalty is cruel and unusual? That is because our understanding of what cruel and unusual means has changed. As time goes by, our understanding of basic principles changes. So the language, the phraseology of the Constitution or any other document does not necessarily mean the same in the past as it means today. The method of constitutional interpretation that takes this approach as the right approach to the constitutional interpretation is called living constitution or organic law. Its most famous proponent in the 20th century was probably Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. But we should understand that since the 20th century to the present day, many justices have embraced this approach. In the 21st century, probably the most vocal advocate of this approach has been Justice Breyer, Stephen Breyer. And in the day of the founders, probably the most prominent advocate of this approach to the Constitution was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson believed that every generation should interpret the meaning of the Constitution for itself. What does this mean? Once again, this means that when the Constitution adopts a very general, very vague language of principles, the understanding of principles has to be matched with current reality, with the understanding of these principles as it exists in society at a given point in time, in a given generation. So while cruel and unusual might not have included death penalty in the 18th century, in the 21st century, it might include death penalty. One way to look at this, or to understand this perspective, is to look at the countries that execute people. And we find that countries that execute people tend to be countries that are not democratic. In fact, they're usually characterized as repressive regimes with little to no history of democracy. Of course, the country that executes the most people would be China. There's no exact number of executions from China, but definitely the number is in the thousands. China is by far and away the largest executioner. Of course, the argument may be that China has a significant chunk of the world's population, which stands at roughly 1.4 billion as of 2016. So the population of China is approximately like the population of the United States, plus Mexico, plus a billion. It's a huge country, but nevertheless, it's even when you take this into consideration, China executes a lot of people. Then comes Iran with 369 executions, then Iraq with 169, Saudi Arabia 79, North Korea 70, and the United States 39. This data is of 2013, but it still remains relevant to this day. So the United States is definitely in the top 6, top 7 countries that execute people, and the United States is the only democratic country among the top 6 or 7 executioners. The only other democratic country that even makes it into the top 10 occasionally is Japan. As of in 2013, Japan executed 8 people. That's a lot for Japan. Usually they execute about 2 to 3 people a year. And we also should remember that the Japanese democracy is a relatively new democracy only since after 1945. Just for the purposes of comparison, let me give you some facts about Japan. In Japan, the support of the death penalty is even stronger than in the United States. However, it's interesting to note that there's a strong small but strong anti-death penalty current, and that traditionally in all countries women tend to oppose death penalty a little bit more than men. And the Japanese government champions women as political officials. Primarily in recent years, Prime Minister Abe's government has championed women in positions of power, particularly as ministers of justice. Minister of Justice Keiko Chiba, who was the first Japanese minister to have attended an execution, was openly opposed to the execution as a method of punishment before she was appointed to her post. But once she was appointed, she changed her tune, and she said that as a government official, she has to follow the will of the government as a whole and the will of the Japanese people as a whole. So it's quite interesting that a person who was actually active as a person, as an activist in trying to abolish the death penalty for over 2 decades, once that person herself became a powerful government official, she said, well, you know what, my personal opinions are one thing, and the will of the people of my country is something else, and I have to follow what the will of the people and the government actually is, and not my personal opinions. What did it mean for the Japanese society? It meant that executions continued. When Keiko Chiba was replaced by Yoko Kamikawa, an interesting name, I think it means holy river. Kami means holy or divine, and Kawa, I think, means river. In 2015, she said, I'm going to continue the executions. And not surprisingly, over 80% of the Japanese people support the death penalty. So the government simply follows along, as really is the standard way of proceeding in a democratic society. When you have this level of support, the government usually follows. Because it's astounding to get 80% of people to agree on any issues in a democracy. That's virtually unheard of. Now, it's interesting that in 2010, the Japanese media was for the first time allowed to attend executions in Japan. It's quite interesting that Tokyo, or in Japan in general, as a society, has a tendency to shroud itself in mystery. And it's interesting that it was only at the end of the first decade of the 21st century that the Japanese government allowed the media and therefore the public to actually see where people are executed and to understand the method of their execution. All of the executions in Japan are done by hanging. All of them. There is no variation, no gas chamber, no lethal injection, no electric chair. Everyone who is executed by hanging. And they bring the condemned people, if there's more than one person to be executed in a year, they execute all people on the same day, and they bring people one by one into this chamber, execution chamber, at the center of which there are two red rectangular lines, and the person stands in a small rectangle, and that rectangle is a trap door. Then the noose is secured around a person's neck. The trap door falls, and the person falls and is left hanging. So you have death by hanging. If you look at the numbers, Japan executes on average 2-3 people a year. In 2011, for example, it was an unusual year. There was no executions at all. In 2013, you had another unusual year. There were 8 executions, which is really a lot by the Japanese standards. So who gets the death penalty in Japan? Only heinous murderers. Usually it's multiple murder aggravated by some serious circumstances. And so that's quite remarkable. We have to keep in mind Japan is a country of 127 million people. So this is a very low number of executions. So yes, Japan is a democratic country, and yes, it has the death penalty, but it is only a relatively recent democracy, and it executes very few people, almost no people, and only the most heinous murderers. If you look at the map of the world and it's color-coded for executions, you will see that a significant chunk of the world still executes people. But in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is the only country. Well, I think this is not quite true because Cuba, the United States, Cuba, and I think Guatemala still practice the death penalty. But certainly the United States is the only democracy in the Western Hemisphere that has the death penalty. Canada had abolished it a very long time ago. Even Mexico abolished the death penalty. It's interesting, some people recently argued that maybe Mexico should reinstate it in light of all the violence that's going on, and even Venezuela doesn't have it. And crime in Venezuela, as in countries north of Venezuela, countries of Central America, like Honduras, that do not have the death penalty, human life actually in Venezuela and Honduras, if you were to look at the homicide rate, human life is worth almost nothing because homicide rate in those countries is absolutely off the charts. Those countries are unsafe, and I have no compunction of stating this and no desire to qualify it because the murder rate is just off the charts. And yet, even those countries do not have the death penalty. Countries like Brazil, Paraguay, Chile have the death penalty, but only actually on paper. In actuality, they do not have it. They reserve it only for extremely severe state crimes like treason or something like that. And of course, if you look at India or on the other side of the world, in the Eastern Hemisphere, India is a democracy since 1947, but it hasn't actually executed a lot of people in the 21st century. Just a handful of people have been executed in India. All of Western and Central Europe, all of it has abolished the death penalty. So that is why Australia, of course, as well, South Africa abolished it. That's why there's been a lot of pressure in the United States to do so, and not just from international organizations like Amnesty International, but even from other countries. I remember when Governor of California, former Governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, refused to pardon Stan Tookie Williams. Stan Tookie Williams was the co-founder of the Crips gang in Los Angeles, and he was found guilty of 4 murders. But in prison, he sort of reformed. He started writing children's books. He was even nominated for a Nobel Prize for Literature, which he did not win, but he was nominated. And this attracted a lot of attention to him. Many people said that Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger should pardon him and commute his sentence from death penalty to life in prison. Schwarzenegger refused because even in the liberal California, most people support the death penalty. So Schwarzenegger's native country of Austria started making noise about how inhumane Arnold really was. No person born in Austria has ever killed anyone except for Hitler and a few other people. And they said, we're not going to name the stadium in your honor. We were going to do it. Now we're not going to do it. So this is what happened. In Europe, public opinion has changed. All of Western and Central Europe abolished the death penalty a long time ago. But in the United States, as you can see, death penalty rolls on. The states that execute the most people are southern states. Texas leads the way, no doubt, but all states in the top 5 year after year are southern states. If you look at the recent list, Texas is followed by Virginia, followed by Florida, then North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina. The number of these are all the numbers of executions since 1977. The reason I cut the line this way is because between 1972 and 1976, the death penalty in the United States was suspended following the case called Furman versus Georgia, when the Supreme Court found that the states sometimes imposed the death penalty in arbitrary ways, in ways which really made death penalty cruel and unusual, not because it is cruel and unusual in and of itself, but because the circumstances in which it was imposed sometimes by some states made that punishment cruel and unusual. And in that particular case, Furman versus Georgia, only two justices, Brennan and Marshall, believed that the death penalty in and of itself was cruel and unusual. So the long and the short of it is that between 1972 and 1976, no death penalty. Then in Craig versus Georgia, the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty because the Supreme Court had found that the states have brought their sentencing guidelines up to constitutional par. Death sentence was reinstated and it continues to roll on. So what conclusions can we reach about its desirability or lack of desirability? First of all, as was the example of Stentuki Williams, which I just gave you, some people argue that when you sentence a person to die, and then after a number of years, when you have pre-trial, then trial, then a number of appeals, after some years go by, it's no longer the same person who had committed the crimes, because if a person has reformed, it's technically the same person with the same name, but the person's mind has changed. So the person you're executing is no longer the person who actually committed murders years or decades ago. Well, some answer that you should speed up the process rather than prolong it, and that way the justice is served, because justice delayed is justice denied. And so instead of waiting for 2 decades to execute someone and then trying to argue this is no longer the same person morally and spiritually, you better hurry and execute the person faster. So that's one possible approach, one possible answer. There are other objections, however, to death penalty. One of them is that an innocent person may well be executed. How do we know this? Well, first of all, generally speaking, no justice system is perfect because it's run by people. And anything that's run by people is going to be subject to mistakes. If you do not believe it, I wish you lots of luck operating in this world. People make mistakes. Even the most diligent, the most careful of people with the most transparent and the best operating systems, you will find mistakes. And the argument is the death penalty is so final that no mistakes should be allowed. You see, if you get life in prison or 20 years in prison, and then years down the road a mistake is discovered, your life, the time that you lost cannot be returned to you, but at least you are alive. At least you can be released after the mistake is discovered, and at least you can be compensated financially. So you don't get your time back, but you get something back for the time that you lost. But the finality of the death sentence is such that no mistakes should be countenanced. You should not take the risk on the death penalty. And in fact, we see that after 1973 and before 2015, at least 130 people have been released from death row because evidence emerged showing their innocence. That's a lot, isn't it? We also know that between 1973 and 1999, there was an average of 3.1 exonerations per year. I would say that's a lot. 3 people a year were on death row who should not have been there. However, between 2000 and 2007, there has been an average of 5 exonerations per year. So there's been a significant increase in the rate of exonerations. What might this suggest? Well, this might suggest that as our CSI methods, as our crime scene investigation methods improved, so did the rate of exonerations. So it looks like improved methods of investigation have led to more exonerations, which suggests that in the past a few people were executed who were in fact not guilty of the crimes for which they were convicted. The number of people on death row, California has the greatest number of people on death row, but it's completely misleading given that California executes very few people. Some die on death row, others have their sentences commuted. So California does have executions, but it rarely actually executes people. So you see, California is followed by Florida, followed by Texas, followed by Alabama. These are the number of people on death row. And the total number in 2015 was just over 3,000 people. So what conclusion can we draw from all of this? Uh, each country goes through its own social history, through its own attitudes on crime and punishment. It is clear that relative to other countries, the United States is a rather safe country. I know this is not what you have seen in the media. You have seen all the devastations and murders, and every other month that you turn on the TV, it looks like there's another school shooting or terrorist shooting or whatever. But relative to other countries, the United States is a safe country. Not as safe as Canada, certainly not as safe as Japan, but much safer than any Latin American country by far and away. Um, and it looks like even when the country was even safer during the first decade of the 21st century, public opinion strongly continued to support death penalty. If you look at the numbers during the 2000s, during the 2010s, public opinion was almost 2-1 in favor of death penalty. And even in liberal states, the attitudes tended to be pro-death penalty. Having said that, as of 2015, 19 states did not have the death penalty at all, and 4 states imposed a moratorium on death penalty. So we are talking about 23 states, for practical purposes, not having any death penalty. That's 23 states. And only 27 having death penalty. But out of these 27 states, 7, 8, or 9 barely execute any people, have hardly executed more than 2-3 people in the last 40 years. So only approximately half the states, or even less than 25 states, execute people on a regular basis in this country. And what the future holds, we do not know. Since crime increased a little bit in the last few years, and since we do see more terrorist attacks, I do not see in the immediate future any drop-off for the support of the death penalty. So this is where we are in the United States today.